And I wanted to welcome you to today's live presentation supporting ADHD learners. The program's hosted by OLT Faculty Development. Today we're using the Zoom's webinar format, and I am promoting everyone to panelists. So you will have access to your camera and microphone, which will be especially beneficial for the Q&A portion of today's event. If you have questions that you would like to ask Karen through chat, could you please enter those into the Q&A box? The chat will be open throughout the presentation for conversation, but I would like to be able to hold some questions for the Q&A portion, and that Q&A box helps keep them very organized. My name is Judith Dutil. I'm one of your session facilitators. And then today we, of course, are pleased to host one of my favorite humans on the earth, Karen Costa. Karen is faculty development facilitator, specializing in online pedagogy and trauma-aware higher education. Karen loves leading faculty learners through fun, interactive, and supportive professional development experiences. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand this presentation over to Karen and to continue promoting everyone to panelists in the Zoom control panel.
Thank you, Judith, and welcome to my fellow panelists. I could just, we'll all do a couple minutes and share our share the wealth here. Thank you so much, Judith and the OLT team. You are in the right place, I hope, supporting ADHD learners in higher education. Got some slides for you, got a guided note-taking template. If you're into that sort of thing, please do what you need to do to settle in. I'll invite everyone to say hello in the chat. I like a nice active, for those of you who know me, I like a nice active chat. So I really feed off that energy. So please do say hello and engage with me throughout the session and with each other. So a reminder, this is a slide I now basically share no matter the topic that I'm talking about. I want to invite you to take care of yourself today. So I used to only use this in my trauma awareness presentations, and now I'm just realizing it's relevant for any topic. So, you know, you never know what's gonna bring up discomfort or challenges. So take care of yourself today. There's a great link here that I'm going to share in the chat with to the SAMHSA organization. So this is a national organization. I share this with faculty, with students. If this brings up any questions or conversations for you, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself, take a break. You can watch the recording, honor your needs today. So I share this slide in all my presentations. I think it's really important to normalize conversations of mental illness and stress in our work in higher education. And I want to always remind learners that my first and foremost priority is your well-being, no matter the topic. So I encourage you to please think about doing something similar in your work, whether you're working with faculty, staff, or students. All right, so a little bit about me. I see familiar names in the chat and I see new folks. So I'm really excited to not only see my friends and also make some new friends. I'm not going to go over this in super detail, but I think I'll start by sharing today that I am a learner with ADHD, and you'll have a chance to, if you're curious about any aspect of ADHD that I don't cover in the presentation, we've got 30 minutes from 1 to 1:30 set aside for questions. So it's a great opportunity to ask somebody who is able and in a position to share that content with you, any questions that you'd like to ask. So I have done lots of work in higher education. I've got a book. The slide deck has links. The slide deck speaker's notes is an entire presentation in itself. Tons of links and resources there. So do use the slide deck to access those. So there's a link to my book, my website, and my Twitter page as well. All right. So I'd like to talk to you now. Enough about me. Thank you, Janae. So a little check-in. In the chat, I want to invite you to share a rose and a thorn. So a rose is something that's going well. You'll see an image on the slide of a rose. Roses have thorns, and a thorn would be a challenge that you're dealing with right now. So I'm going to pause and take a breath and a sip of water, and I'll invite you to share that if you're interested, if that works for you today, in the chat. Ooh, Tracy. I think folks are going to feel that one. Tracy sharing in the chat, my rose and thorn are the same, being back on campus. Anyone else relate to that? Oh, my student, thank goodness for my students. I don't know. And I know everybody's dealing with different challenges. I really just love my students are keeping me centered. Lots of challenges and also positives being shared. I see a Tai Chi class. That's awesome. Please keep those coming. My rose is that I don't hear right now the sounds of the tree grinder anymore. So, you know, things always do work out in the end. My thorn is I'm a Red Sox fan. And if anybody's been following baseball, you'll know that that's a tricky one. So this is a check-in that you can do with your learners. I share in more detail in the speaker's notes how you might use this. I like it because it adapts well. People can share some, you know, what they feel comfortable with, but it also acknowledges that life is both beautiful and hard. It's really important for me to check in with my learners at the start of any learning experience so that I'm not constantly centering myself, whether we're face-to-face or online. So this is something you can use in your own teaching. One of many of these, I do different check-ins every time I present. This was the one that just grabbed me this time. Thank you all who are sharing. I see people saying, yes, me too. Yes, me too. Yes, the same. Oh, Brianne, lovely. Thank you so much for sharing. Brianne says, students in the class I'm teaching are my rose and a thorn is managing my own ADHD. Wonderful. Okay, so here are my goals for today. And I'm going to ask you for your goals for today in a minute. So you might want to shift into thinking about that. My big goal is that I want us to shift into a mindset of being strengths-based and challenge aware when we talk about supporting ADHD learners. We, by and large, have a deficit-based mindset around supporting ADHD learners. So I want to invite us into this new mindset. I want everybody to leave pretty clear about defining ADHD. We're going to go over some key concepts and models. And then at the end, we're going to be going over practical strategies. So if you've worked with me before, you know I'm a Libra. So I want to balance the big picture theories and concepts with really practical strategies that you can start using immediately. And then we've got 30 minutes for Q&A. So in the chat, I'd love for y'all to share. What else are you hoping to get out of this workshop, or what brought you to this workshop? So I'm going to pause again and take a breath. I know I talk fast. My mind moves fast and my mouth moves fast as well. What are your goals for being here today, and what brought you here today? These are my goals, but I'd love to hear what you hope to get out of this workshop. Okay, here we go. Helping students, appropriate instructional design, accommodations, neurodiversity. Yep, that's on the list. I want to do better for my ADHD students. Amazing. Understanding support. Someone is sharing they have a child with ADHD. How can we support our children? Disability Resource Center. We're going to talk about all this. Okay, good. So we're at crossover with autism supports. Trail, thank you. We're going to talk about a lot of this, and if there's anything that you've come here for today that I don't get to in my presentation, bring it into the Q&A. I might not have the answers, but I can give you some ideas about who might, and I bet some of your colleagues can also share ideas about how we can get your goals met. Okay. I told y'all I like an active chat, and I structure my workshop in this way. So my next invitation to you is to fill in the blank here. ADHD is blank. So in the chat, I'll take a breath and pause. Go ahead and fill in the blank. Finish the sentence. ADHD is blank. Lisa is sharing that ADHD is a superpower. Tracy is a friend, truly a friend, right, Tracy? I hope you feel the same way, that I have never met IRL. And Tracy just shared ADHD is a lot. I agree. An adventure, it's complex. It relates to variable attention, hyperfocus, misunderstood, a lifelong journey. Bravo. I see I see a strengths-based, challenge-aware response to that question. So I'm seeing one of my goals getting met here. So I'm thrilled already. So I'm going to share now some definitions that I use for ADHD, but I want to point something out. Before I shared my definitions with y'all, I asked you about what you know about ADHD. So that is one of my primary pedagogical strategies. I ask learners first, what do you know about this before I impose my ideas on them? And there's a note about that in the speaker's notes if you'd like to learn more. Okay. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. This comes from the DSM. The DSM stands for Diagnostic. I have this written down because I never remember it. Who would want to? Okay, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The note I have written for that in the speaker's notes is EEK, not very strengths-based and challenge-aware, huh? So many people have very strong feelings about the DSM in positive directions and negative directions. I try to take the middle path. For me, a diagnosis is for me to decide how I'm going to handle it. It can be a gift. It is a tool for me to use, and I am able to reject it and say, that doesn't define me. And I'm also able to accept it and say, how can I use this to connect to more resources and support? I'm able to do both at the same time. So that is what's worked for me. But I want to be clear that this phrase is pulled from the DSM, which has this very long history and is very complex. Okay, so we're gonna take it with a grain of salt. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Some of you may have still be using or have heard of ADD, right? Which stands for attention deficit disorder. They rename things every year in the DSM, and we'll talk about that another time. We'll talk about that another time. ADD is no longer in the DSM. It's been retired. It's still often used. Okay. And actually, before I move on, if you identify as ADD and that's the term you were diagnosed with or that you're comfortable with, great. It's not that you can't use it. It's officially retired. Okay, so this is the definition that I like, and I'm going to hold up a book here, and the book is in the speaker's notes. This was one of the first books that I read when I was diagnosed with ADHD. The author's name is Sari Solden. She is a clinician. I am not a clinician. I'll probably say that many times during this workshop. The book is called Women with Attention Deficit Disorder. So again, she was using the old language of ADD, which is perfectly fine. Solden defines ADHD as a lifelong neurobiological genetic syndrome. The syndrome leads to structural, chemical, communication, and arousal differences in the brain. And these differences impact the executive functioning system in the brain. Okay. So some of us have been taught, I was certainly taught this, that ADHD is the kid in class who can't, typically the young boy in class who can't sit still and who gets on their teacher's nerves, right? And so the problem is the kid can't sit still, and the problem is the teacher's stressed out about it, but it's just, that's all, right? Is it really like, what's going on there? Just sit still. Let's keep this kid quiet. Let's quiet them down and let's move on. So this definition opens us up to a much broader view of ADHD. And I think it helps us to understand that this is a really serious condition that people deal with really every moment of their lives. It's impacting us in very, very deep ways. So Solden's definition is the one that I rely on today. I might change my mind tomorrow. What do we mean by executive functioning? So if you haven't heard of exec functioning before, I'm so glad you're here. This is really important for teaching and learning. Executive functioning relates to things like working memory. We're going to define that in more detail later, but basically it's the ability to hold an idea in your mind so that you can then work with it. Focus is getting started. So focus was choosing to come here today, and there's lots of other things you could be doing, but you focused in on this webinar. Concentration is staying with a task. So it's, even though your phone is beeping and your email is beeping and things are going on in your life, you're choosing to stay in this webinar and keep your concentration here. Decision making, impulse control, self-regulation, and time management. So I'm hoping folks understand that this is like living life. And these are the areas of the brain that are impacted for folks with ADHD. So this is a big deal. This is a huge challenge that deeply impacts people's lives. And we know so much now about what we can do to support people with these challenges. I want to emphasize so this is another big takeaway for us. And I might have done this before I was diagnosed with ADHD. So if you're doing this, this is not to shame you. But when we say things like, oh, I'm so ADHD because, we misplaced our keys, I want to invite people to think about how that feels for somebody with this lifelong neurobiological genetic syndrome, right? So if you missed an appointment yesterday, or you look at your phone a lot, that does not mean you have ADHD, right? So this is a neurobiological condition. That's my understanding of it. Other people would probably disagree with me. But no, not everyone has ADHD. If you've got questions that are coming up, I want to remind you, pop them in the Q&A. So that you might have questions about this slide, pop them in the Q&A. We got 30 minutes to dive into them. Or pop them in the chat. I mean, we'll get to them better later if you put them in Q&A, but if you want to engage with your peers in the chat, feel free to pop questions in there. Okay, question for y'all. Feel free to share in the chat, yes or no. Is ADHD a disability? Or not just yes or no, however you'd like to respond. What do folks think? Is ADHD a disability? Go ahead and share in the chat. Cheryl is saying, I think it can be. And if you've never thought about this before, it's a great question. I was chatting just earlier on Twitter about anxiety as a disability, and we were having some great conversations about that. It can require accommodations. So Tracy's saying, yes, I think it can. Invisible disability. I'm not really sure, Janae is saying, and Trail's saying, yep. Okay, so I have some, I'll actually pop them. I'm going to pop this in the chat. So there's a definition of disability from the CDC that I find very helpful in processing what it means for me to be a person with a disability that I'll share with you. And it really, I've talked to some folks lately who think of who I know are dealing with very specific challenges, but they don't consider themselves disabled because they don't qualify for disability payments from the government. So disability, just because you don't seek out, disability from the government, or don't feel that you would qualify for that, that's not really how we define disability. So you might want to check out that link. I've also given you a great link. I've been talking a lot with folks about this, about identity first language. So it's perfectly fine to say, as we're talking about ADHD as a disability, it's perfectly fine to say person with a disability. I'm a person with a disability, but it's also perfectly fine to say disabled person. I'm a disabled person, right? I've been living with this my entire life. So that's not news to me. So there's a great article that talks about that in more detail that I'll invite you to look at. But my short answer is, if that benefits you to define yourself that way, that based on how we typically define disabilities, ADHD is absolutely a disability. Again, for me, I'm able to both reject and accept this at the same time, and to use this as a tool, recognizing myself as somebody who has a disability as a way to connect with support and correct care, not as a way to see myself as somebody that is deficient in any way. And please, if that connects with you, please keep chatting about that. I see some action in the chat, which is wonderful. Okay, so a little bit of like name that tune ADHD version. Let's name some assets, right? So we just talked about kind of that lifelong neurobiological condition that has all these executive function challenges, right? Those are serious challenges. Let's add some assets to the conversation. So what do you know about your ADHD learners, or if you identify as having ADHD, what are some of your assets or your child's assets or your student's assets? Let's just go wild here with assets. Creativity. Oh, hilarity. What a great word. The dopamine rush. Deep curiosity. Yes. Immense curiosity. Aren't those things, the number one thing that faculty say to me? I work with so many faculty, and I say, how can I help you in your teaching? And they say, I need to get my students engaged. Look at this list. Isn't this what we're looking for, right? How do we channel that? How do we channel that and see that asset in our classrooms and in our meeting spaces? Janae, yes, bravo. Okay, so y'all are feeding that list. Here are some of mine. So you'll see things like creativity, the boundless energy, the abundance of ideas through the roof, ideas you've never thought of before, you couldn't imagine. Our ADHD learners are just amazing idea factories, and just ready to engage with our classes. They're passionate. I talk about like that first responder mindset. So we see a lot of ADHD folks in the first responder field. Funny story, my grandfather was a first responder, and I found a news article from an old newspaper where he said they asked him why he got into the work, and he said, well, it's never dull. And that, they do say that ADHD is highly genetic. So I found that really interesting. There's a great book in the speaker's notes called The Edison Gene. So Thomas Edison, an inventor, right? You could do worse than, emulating Thomas Edison and all of his inventions, right? So we just have a tremendous wealth of passion and energy here. If we've got a classroom that is in need of engagement, our ADHD learners, let's channel what's already there. This is a huge asset to higher education and our classrooms and our meeting spaces and our libraries and our tutoring centers and so on and so forth. Beautiful. Yeah, Cheryl, innovators. Absolutely. Okay. So I'm going to bombard you with a little bit of data here. So how many people have ADHD? 5%. We think maybe. I pull a lot of my data. It's in the speaker's notes from, this is one of the most recent books about ADHD that came out. So it's got really great up-to-date data. It's called ADHD 2.0. Both authors are medical doctors that also have ADHD. So I love them. We think 5% of the population. That said, ADHD is underdiagnosed in girls and women. I was diagnosed at age 40. The diagnosis process is complex, but the results of my psychological testing were such that we wouldn't suspect that I have a mild case of ADHD. Okay. So that I went 40 years without a diagnosis is, telling. So I don't believe in that 5% number, but it's a starting point for a conversation. We also know that in marginalized communities, there is a lack of support for what I'll call appropriate diagnosis and correct care. The data here is mixed. Sometimes we're finding that there is an overdiagnosis, right? So a kid from a marginalized community is acting out in class or not sitting still, and there's sometimes a tendency to just slap that ADHD label on them. And to try to answer that question that is much more complex. Maybe the curriculum in the classroom and the teaching style is not culturally relevant. There's a lot of other things that could be going on there. That said, there's also a tendency there's a belief that there's a lot of ADHD kids in marginalized communities and adults not getting access to diagnoses and correct care and treatment. My message here is disaggregate the data always, no matter what we're talking about, ADHD or anything else. Here's some bad news. And remember, we are strengths-based and challenge aware. Okay, so we just named all those gorgeous assets, and we're going to talk about strategies that work to support people. However, there is some really troubling data about life expectancy and health outcomes for folks with ADHD. This comes from the work of Russell Barkley. He is a slightly controversial figure in the ADHD community. I've got all the sites in the speaker's notes for y'all who want to read more. But Barkley has done research on this, and he has found that ADHD has a significant reduction in life expectancy. In severe cases, Barkley has found that life expectancy can be reduced by up to 21 years for folks with ADHD. So I'm sure you can probably think about why that might be. But what I want to emphasize here is that that is in an untreated case where someone has not been connected to correct care. Correct care is, I have a boo-boo on my foot, I go to a podiatrist, right? Correct care is, I'm having trouble with my vision, I get seen by an eye doctor, right? So correct care is connecting to experts who can give us the best, latest treatment and guidance to support any health issue, whether it's ADHD or not. So when we get treatment for ADHD, these negative outcomes just drastically drop. Okay, but treatment really matters. I appreciate you all so much in the chat. I see you sharing, and I just am so grateful for that. Most of us probably work in higher ed. This is not rocket science. Lower success rates for folks with ADHD. And again, those sites are in the speaker's notes. So most ADHD experts say we need to stop thinking about this as, oh, that kid can't sit still in class and he's calling out, right? This is way bigger than that. This is a serious public health issue. Okay. So I'm going to shift this into some key concepts. I want to remind everybody, if you haven't typed out your question, pop it into the Q&A. If you have questions that, they might get lost, but you want to engage with them right now, there's an active community of your peers in the chat. So I'll invite you to share in there. I'm really excited about these key concepts, y'all. So has anybody, just informally in the chat, has anybody heard of VAST as a new model to think about ADHD? VAST stands for Variable Attention Stimulus Trait. Jeff, I thought you were going to say yes, because you mentioned something about variable attention earlier. Thank you to those saying no. Yes, Brianne's like, no, but I'm excited to learn about it. When I first saw this, I thought, oh my word, like someone understands my brain. Okay. There's links to more articles about VAST in the speaker's notes. So VAST is another way to understand ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That implies that I lack attention. When I received that diagnosis, when I thought about ADHD, there's something that's not what's going on in my brain. What's going on in my brain is an entire galaxy. I don't know if folks relate to that. What's going on in my brain is an entire galaxy. It's a beautiful place to be. It's wild. It's wild. There's a lot in there, and there's a lot of things I need to do to kind of tone down the galaxy. I have an excess of attention. I am paying attention to everything all at once, all the time. ADHD is the inability to target and focus my attention at will. Okay, so this is discussed at length in this wonderful book, ADHD 2.0, which was written again by two medical doctors who have ADHD. So this is a great reminder to us, again, to go back to engagement in the classroom. You've got learners in there who are, and you've got, colleagues in your meetings who have an entire galaxy in their brain, who are passionate and curious and just ready to talk about it all and to just soak up life and learning. So the idea that this is a deficit of attention is really problematic. Okay. What we need is we need guidance. Hollowell talks about it as having a race car brain with bicycle brakes. I have often thought of my brain as like a bobsled, and sometimes that bobsled is not on the track. It's big and it's going fast, right? I need the track. I need the track. So this is one of the newest concepts in the field of ADHD, and it's really important. So if somebody says to you that, implies that somebody with ADHD lacks the ability, lacks attention, they're missing a really important part of the conversation. I'm so glad that's, connecting with people. It's certainly changed things for me. And I love the word vast. It's a vast place to be in my brain. Okay. Has anybody heard of or have a guess as to what these letters stand for? We're going to talk about the DMN. I'll give you a hint. They relate to the brain. The DMN and the TPN. Does anybody have any thoughts about what those are? Anybody have ever heard of those? And they relate to a glitchy switch. I don't see anybody volunteering here. Okay, good. And just notice how I paused and asked you to kind of check in on your brain and see if there were any neurons there that wanted to raise their hand, right? A little teaching strategy that I weave in. Okay, so DMN stands for default mode network. It's one of the coolest parts of the brain, and I love learning about it. Default mode network is when we are in that reflective state, daydreaming, ruminating, default mode network. That's where our brain's default mode, right? That's where they go. That's what they default to. The TPN is the task positive network. I sometimes say task processing network. So if I do that, I'm just giving you a little disclaimer. I know what it is, but I forget. The task positive network. This is when our brain goes and activates that task positive network when we are doing active focus and work. I'm in that TPN right now. Right. And because of the stimulation that I'm getting from the chat, remember I said I need that chat to stay engaged. Because of the stimulation I'm getting from you, my colleagues and my friends engaging with me, I am able to stay into that TPM. Okay. What we have found in folks, what they have, not we, I didn't do this research, but it's documented extensively in this book and other places. What they have found in the research is that typically for a neurotypical person, when the TPN activates, so I go into a task, the DMN, the default mode, reflective, goes off. Okay, it deactivates. Guess what happens in folks with ADHD? That system's a little glitchy. We get stuck making that transition between those networks. And the DMN, the default mode, the reflective mode, the daydreaming mode, appears to stay active while the TPN is working. So we are in that reflective, thinking about other things, daydreaming mode. We can be in that mode while we're also working on a task. Okay. I don't know if that resonates with anybody, but it resonates with me. I can be having a conversation with my husband where I need to be engaged and listening to him and asking questions and affirming him as a good listener could do. And I am also I'm doing that, but also at the same time, I'm not fully there. I'm in that reflective state. And I really have to, certain things that I do can help me stay focused. So fidgeting helps me stay focused, right? Walking while I'm having a conversation helps me stay focused in that TPN rather than getting sucked into that DMN. So another way to think about this is for folks with ADHD, our brains distract themselves. This is not about ignorance or a lack of will or a desire to learn. If your learners with ADHD, appear to be daydreaming or not focusing, this is not a deficit. This is just how their brains work. So we can give them additional structures and support to help them stay in that task processing network when appropriate. Okay. Another really important concept I'm so excited to share with you because we're getting some new research on this, rejection sensitive dysphoria, RSD. So a quick little poll in the chat, maybe give me a yes or no. Have you heard of RSD before today? I've got some yeses and I've got mostly no's. So I'm thrilled. Yay. This is really important for us to learn about as higher educators to work with students and to work with our peers. So RSD is a trait that appears to coexist with ADHD. This is my understanding of it. It is an extreme sensitivity to perceived criticism. Note the word perceived, right? That the offerer, the giver of the information might not see it as criticism, but because of RSD, the receiver might perceive it that way. And this is an extreme sensitivity. It is not overreacting. And probably one of the worst things we could say to somebody who experiences RSD is you're overreacting. Okay. RSD, and there's links in those amazing speaker notes that are a great resource to learn more about it. It's neurologic and it's genetic. So because of that those neurobiologic differences in our brains, we just process things differently. So this is not overreacting. It's not just having a bad day. This is a really serious concern that a lot of folks with ADHD have. Here's a couple ways this is going to play out. I don't know if this is this is going to be familiar to some folks. You might try to be perfect to avoid that criticism, because that criticism is so painful to you as an ADHD learner. You work yourselves into the ground in order to avoid it. And Cheryl, I see a question there. So RSD is not currently a formal diagnosis, so it's not something in DSM, but experts on ADHD are recognizing it as basically like a trait or a condition that ADHD folks primarily experience, but it can absolutely overlap with we would see it with other conditions. And there's more links in the chat that will go over that. So think about trying to be perfect every single day so that nobody criticizes you, because the second somebody criticizes you, it feels painful on every level of your being. Not ideal, right? So we don't want that. We don't want that for our learners. We don't want that for ourselves or for our students. We also see somebody give up completely to avoid criticism? Would that be a very logical response to being a person who experiences RSD and going into a college classroom or a college work environment and experiencing relentless negative criticism? Wouldn't giving up be a very, healthy response to that, because you're protecting yourselves? But we don't want that. We don't want our learners or our colleagues to leave to avoid criticism. This is considered to be a trait. This is considered to be a trait in the vast majority of folks with ADHD, and they do discuss it at length in the little handbook here that I'm offering you, ADHD 2.0. A third of folks with ADHD say this is the worst part. The distraction is tough. The constant bombardment of motion in my brain is tough. But the hardest part is the rejection sensitive dysphoria. The hardest part is that every time somebody says boo to me, it just feels like it's just the hardest thing. It hurts. It hurts on many levels. The folks who study RSD argue that it is more damaging for women and girls, right? So we're already underdiagnosing women and girls. So we're not connecting them to correct care. And then we're also exacerbating this because RSD is tougher for these folks. So I want to invite people to consider the role of feedback and criticism in higher education. And this is a UDL thing, right? This is probably good for everybody, but it's certainly good for folks with ADHD. There's a big difference in saying, this introduction was terrible and you didn't meet any, you didn't use any of the strategies that I taught about in class, and finding the gold in that student's essay, because I know that gold is there. We can always find a piece of gold. Sometimes the gold is that they submitted it, right? We can find the gold and then we can highlight that and build on that, and then encourage that student to work on improving that introduction. And here are some strategies and here's some support, right? Maybe it's connecting students with support, with tutoring and support services. But I just need folks to know that we're really, really not creating accessible learning environments if we're relying solely on that intense, toxic rigor, negative feedback model that exists through so much of higher education. That's a really ableist approach. The good news is that positive feedback feels like amazing to ADHD folks. So Hollowell talks about this in the book, calls it RSE, rejection sensitive euphoria. So you offer that positive feedback, it's going to feel like gold. So harness that for your ADHD learners. Okay, another key concept. I'm hoping folks are a little more familiar with this, working memory. So we bring things in to our brains through our senses, right? We take things in and then they go into our what we call the working memory system of the brain. And I think of working memory like Play-Doh. If you want me to make a hot dog, that's like what everybody makes out of Play-Doh first, right? If you want me to make a Play-Doh or a hot dog out of Play-Doh, I need to be able to hold that Play-Doh in order to shape it and form it, right? When you have ADHD, things just kind of sometimes slide through. It's slippery in there. It's tough for us to hold on to things because there's a whole galaxy. We're pretty busy. So ADHD learners struggle to hold on to things. So the classic example of this, does anybody do this? Because I used to. You're face-to-face in-person, on ground, whatever the heck we're calling it, setting. Your learners are leaving class and you're yelling out the door, don't forget to bring da 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 next week, or don't forget to read da da da, or don't forget to do da da da. For somebody with ADHD, it's like, oh yeah. And then, what time's lunch? And I need to, go do this. And what about that? Right. So we're not able to hold things in our brains in the same way as neurotypical folks. So this has benefits, right? ADHD people are really fun and playful because we have a sense of living in the moment. And we aren't very hierarchical about things. And I'm making broad generalizations here. So take these with a grain of salt. But it's important that things are written down, that things are given reminders are given multiple times, and we're going to talk more about this, multisensory learning experiences. Just saying it and expecting an ADHD learner to hold it in their brain is not going to cut it, because it's going to float out and they're not going to be able to hold on to it in order to shape it into a new learning experience. Have folks heard about masking? Feel free to share that in the chat. So there is a lot of overlap between ADHD and autism. I do not identify as somebody who has autism, so I can't speak to that experience. But there's a lot of overlap there that we're learning about. And masking first really came out of the autism community. So I want to give a little shout out there, and you can do more research on that, certainly. We are finding that masking is a trait of ADHD learners. For me, what masking means is mimicking neurotypical folks, trying to pretend that I don't have these needs and I don't have these learning differences, and to try to act like everybody else. What we found is this is pretty debilitating psychologically and emotionally, to try to pretend to be something you're not. So the goal here, I want to remind everybody, the goal is never to turn ADHD learners into neurotypical learners. The goal is to celebrate all those assets and all those strengths, and to support people, give them access to correct care, to community, so that we can be truly ourselves, and to manage those challenges that we face. So keep that in mind. We're not trying to make our ADHD learners be something that they're not, or our ADHD colleagues in any capacity. Thank you, Trail. Trail's sharing some thoughts in the chat about that. Okay, so how does your institution, if you don't mind sharing in the chat, currently support, and I'm talking about like writ large here. So on a big picture level, I'm a learner with ADHD and I come into your institution. How am I getting supported? Not just specific to your classroom. We're going to shift into that in a minute. If you don't mind sharing, what Brianna's saying, accommodations. So Brianna, I'm assuming, yep. Brenda, thank you. A disability resource center. Okay. So can all, a question for y'all is, can everyone with ADHD access that? That's an interesting question for us to consider. What types of accommodations do those learners get? What about your faculty and staff, right? How do they access accommodations and support? Again, I just activated your prior knowledge before. Yeah, not great news there in the chat. So we're gonna try to shift into some positive moments in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about accommodations, accessibility, and UDL. Okay, so considering what we've just learned about ADHD, so things like VAST and struggles with working memory and the tendency to mask, and that this is a really serious big deal that we deal with on a daily basis. Think about what that process of getting formal accommodations is like, whether you're faculty, staff, or students. Think about that process. It involves multiple steps, right? It typically involves paperwork. Yeah, paperwork involved, lots of details, the ability to remember things, to keep appointments, to follow through, to learn how to navigate that I got to go talk to this person, but now I got to go talk to this person. Okay. The very process of getting formal accommodations is not typically accessible for ADHD learners. So, access to a diagnosis, first of all, is a privilege that not everybody has. We know that certain populations are underdiagnosed. So this is a real problem point, I think. What many folks have done is said, yeah, you're completely right. That's why we use UDL, Universal Design for Learning. I think we can do both. I think we can fix and improve accommodations and continue to use UDL. So let's talk a little bit about that. The traditional model of higher education is really the opposite of what most ADHD folks need, right? So an hour-long class where I'm sitting in a chair being lectured to is physically uncomfortable for me. It feels like I'm going to come out of my skin. It's excruciating. It's even talking about it right now, I'm feeling anxiety bubble up. Okay. So the traditional model of education that we have designed is really the opposite of what works for ADHD learners. As I just said, boredom is often described by people with ADHD as a physically painful experience. So we know that that's working against us in many cases. Not that all faculty or educators use that model, but it's the traditional model of higher education, and a lot of folks are still using it. Common accommodations we give folks, or extra time's the big one, right? Oh, we'll give you extra time. We'll give you extra time. Extra time solves everything. Extra time does not actually solve everything. There's some mixed data on extra time. A friend I met on Twitter described it as extra time is just leaving people, up in the plane and circling around. That ADHD learners need help landing the plane. So for me, give me extra time, but if I don't have the structure and support, I'm just going to keep circling. Extra time actually just makes it harder for me because I'm suffering longer, right? I need help finishing. I need help getting things submitted. I need help landing that plane. There's a link to a YouTube video I created on that exact subject of landing the plane and what that would look like. But extra, we got to get away from this extra time solves everything conversation. We need lots of support, correct care, high engagement, stimulation on things that interest us. I don't care what topic you teach. You can find a way to connect that to your learners' interests, because ADHD learners have a million interests. So don't tell me you can't find a way to connect it to their interests. And you can find a way to get them that stimulation and engagement that they need to engage with that learning. Yes, and it absolutely is helpful for everyone. And it's really important for ADHD learners. So again, I say this a lot, UDL is great. It's not the end all be all. So we still need, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. We still need specific support. So an example of that, an ADHD learner might need weekly academic coaching, somebody to help them plan their calendar and help them decide when they're going to be working on their assignments. They might need extended time. They might need low distraction learning spaces when they're taking tests, especially. So accommodations are important. We got to do better at connecting students to them. UDL is great for all learners, but it's not the sole answer to supporting ADHD learners. All right. In the chat, we're going to shift into those practical strategies. And I think we're kind of on time here. Share with me that was kind of the institutional view in your classroom, and whatever that means. The classroom could be a hallway, a library, a cafeteria, a tutoring center, et cetera, et cetera. Your home. What strategies are you using to engage and support learners with ADHD? So go ahead and share, if you don't mind, in the chat. We've got some great chat going here. I see a book recommendation, Jay Domich. I'm just joined a book club to read that book. So if you don't mind, in the chat, what are some of the specific things you do? Fake deadlines, Jola, I'm so intrigued. I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, that you have deadlines in place, but that they are flexible deadlines. But I love that. Lots of structure, lots of reminders. Yes. So I get nervous about classrooms that are wicked flexible and wicked open. Love flexibility, love openness, love learning-centered classrooms. ADHD learners need a ton of structure. Structure breeds support, and it breeds flexibility, right? If I need that bobsled track, okay, you don't want the bobsled off the track. We need the structure. Cheerleading, encouragement, beautiful. That's the rejection sensitive euphoria. Group work to get energy and support from others. Hands-on, gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous estimated times on assignments. Yes, ADHD folks have a tough time estimating how long things will take. So that's wonderful. Y'all are already doing a lot of this work. Okay, so here are some tips I have for you, some strategies that you can start using in your classroom. One of them is to start educating yourself about this concept of neurodiversity. And I know somebody had said, I want to learn more about neurodiversity. So folks who are who argue for this concept of neurodiversity say these are all expected variations in our brains, right? All brains are different and all brains have strengths and challenges. Neurodiversity offers us that opening into a more strengths-based model. There is some criticism of some versions of neurodiversity that say, there's nothing wrong with you. This is a completely made up thing, a complete societal construct. You're perfect. Go live your lives. And a lot of people with ADHD are saying, I can't do that because I deal with this on this neurobiological challenge on a daily basis. So for me, neurodiversity is a reminder to focus on strengths and balance that with awareness of challenges. The other great thing I've taken from the neurodiversity community is the phrase, nothing about us without us. So I get really nervous when there's conversations about disability on campus and there are not disabled folks present who are leading and guiding that conversation. So the autistic community, that nothing about us without us came through our wonderful autistic community. And it's a real offering and a gift to us. So that's something that we can keep in mind. Refer and partner. So y'all might have heard me say this about trauma work. This is not me work, it's we work. So yes, most of us have accessibility services on campus, so they can be our partners. But have we thought about partnering with our learners, whether they are faculty, staff, or students? So please, we do not need a savior. We're all good with the savior pity mentality, right? We don't need you to fix us or save us or make our deficits go away. We would love, though, for you to partner with us. So things like posting accommodations on a regular basis, accommodations information on a regular basis, asking for pedagogical support from your teaching and learning staff, right? I'm not, I don't have students this term who have disclosed disabilities, but I know they're probably in this class and they weren't able to, for whatever reason, access formal accommodations. And I think I can actually go above and beyond formal accommodations. What can I do, right? Your teaching and learning center staff. Model and encourage help seeking for your students. To the extent you feel comfortable, let them know that you need support for, whether it's ADHD or whatever, for a variety of challenges. Focus on normalizing and reclaiming help seeking. Celebrate failure, right? Failure is about making mistakes. And I heard it said, we make mistakes so we can learn how to make more. And I share that with my students every term and they go wild. So you can borrow that. I don't know where I heard it. Mind the cognitive load. So I hope folks have heard about cognitive load. I think of it like the outlets in your house, and you can't plug in the hairdryer and the space heater at the same time. And I know this because I do it and I forget, because the circuit gets overloaded. So we all have limited cognitive resources. Two words, though, that I don't think a lot of folks know about are germane cognitive load and extraneous cognitive load. Germane is relevant to the content. So if I'm teaching a US history course, the germane cognitive load is the process of learning about historical concepts, okay? The extraneous cognitive load is everything else. It's learning to read the syllabus. It's learning that this is how my professor grades. It's learning that this is where I need to sit in class. It's learning how to use Zoom. It's learning about, how often this professor sends announcements and emails and where to submit my work. So to the extent possible, we need to really think about managing extraneous cognitive load. And it's wild, right? So like the 5-page email is not it. That's extraneous cognitive load. We've got to, for all of us, we've got to reconsider that, but especially for our ADHD learners. So think to yourself when you're planning your courses, is this germane? Is this going to be using my students' germane cognitive load? Is it relevant to my subject matter? Or is it extraneous cognitive load? There's going to be extraneous cognitive load. Are there ways that I can reduce that and streamline that for my learners? So chunking information, streamlining information, not sending out huge info dumps are all ways that we can help students manage their cognitive load. Teach metacognition. So what's metacognition? Thinking about thinking. We've got a picture here of a I don't know what kind of animal this exactly is. I feel like it's a very specific type of monkey, so I don't want to embarrass myself and guess, but it's a certain kind of monkey, and he's thinking about thinking clearly. He's using his metacognition. So we have found that metacognition works really well for ADHD learners. And yes, of course, it's going to be good for everybody else. So metacognition, and there's lots of juicy notes on metacognition in your speaker's notes in the slides. How did you approach that assignment, Karen? How did it work for you? Did it go well? What was a challenge for you? What would you have done differently? How could I have better supported you? That's metacognition. So those little check-ins with your students around things like test taking, note taking, how they study, how they approach their course, you can very simply weave them into your course. A great tool is Google Forms. How did you approach this assignment? What worked well? What didn't work well? What can I do to support you? What might you do differently in the future? Make it multisensory. ADHD learners, we can be messy. There's an entire art room behind me that is proof of this. This is not about learning styles, but we've got these amazing senses. So let's use all of them if possible. So letting students, I saw hands on, letting students get messy and use their hands, bring coloring back into your class, bring paint, arts and crafts time. Let's do it. I had a faculty who taught neuroscience who had students making neurons and connections in the brain with Play-Doh, right? Back to the Play-Doh. Auditory reminders. So I use my phone and my devices to remind me of things. We need the touch of writing things down. So helping learners to really be in there and in a multi-sensory experience. This is me begging. This is an image. No, this is an image of a little, I think, hamster or guinea pig begging. We need more consistency across courses. They're not easy answers here because we want to respect faculty autonomy and creativity and academic freedom. But think about the fact that students typically have to relearn how to succeed in every single one of your courses, because the answer is the way to succeed in this course is different than in this course, and it's different than in this course. The syllabi are different, the setups of courses are different, the grading scheme is different, and so on and so forth. So that extraneous cognitive load is huge. And because of my working memory challenges, it's exhausting for me to relearn. So I would love to invite our institutions to make this an institution-wide approach to some awareness that consistency is our friend. And how can we do that and balance faculty creativity and academic freedom? There's a link in the speaker's notes about a master filing system that's used at Landmark College, which is a college that supports learners with a variety of learning differences. Every first class, the first class these students take, they create this binder that includes all their learning plans and their study goals and everything about how they learn best. And then they use that binder in every single course they take at Landmark. I love this. Rather than just a one-time FYE course and good luck after that, we need to be weaving those college success strategies into all of their courses. Yes, Denise. So there's links to that in the speaker's notes for y'all to consider. Last two slides. I know we're kind of at time for the Q&A, but I'm pretty close and I'm going to take it. These are like just my final thoughts wrapped up into the last couple slides. I want to remind folks that we're all learners. So all of this can be used to support faculty, staff, and students. Design against boredom. Boredom, I see that thing sometimes where it's like, well, I was born in college and, and I did fine. And it's good to be bored once in a while. And that's true. That's true. Once in a while, boredom can breed creativity and it can motivate us to create some new things in life. But for ADHD learners, it's kryptonite. So an hour-long lecture class does not cut it. We've got to really think about how we can make that lecture engaging, weave in some active learning strategies, and harness those amazing assets of our ADHD learners. Whenever possible, give choices. Your ADHD learners have a million interests, so you can find a way to connect with those interests as it pertains to your course. I guarantee it. So give choices so that students can connect with their interests. Differentiating instruction is not about learning styles, by the way. It's about the way I perceive it is it's acknowledging individual interests. So as I just said, I clearly have a thing for Care Bears, right? So can I bring Care Bears into this course assignment? Please tell me why not, because I can't think of a good reason. So connect with your learners' individual interests and passions, Minecraft, cycling, travel, whatever, and let them connect that to your course concepts. Partner with your ADHD learners. They know things you don't know. Keep that strengths-based challenge-aware mindset. We also need role models. So if your institution only looks at disabilities in terms of providing accommodations, you're really missing the mark. So I've got a link in the speaker's notes for more information on how you can start a disability cultural center. I know some folks who are maybe doing a dissertation on that too. So we're going to learn more about that. We need to celebrate the assets. We need to say, I'm a disabled person. This is what my experience is like. This is what I have to offer, and to be able to connect with other disabled folks. And again, I said this before, nothing about us without us. And our last slide here before we transition over to the questions. ADHD learners are awesome. We have challenges, we have strengths, we have so many things to offer. So let's really invite the assets into these conversations. I hear way too many conversations that are only about deficits. If you are not an ADHD learner and you hear those conversations, I said nothing about us without us, but we invite you to interrupt that and say, hey, this is a deficit-based conversation. Where are the assets? Where are the strengths? We would love to invite you to do that on our behalf. Your ADHD learners might not trust you. Many learners have had really difficult K through 12 experiences, and that is not a criticism of K through 12 teachers. It's a criticism of the system. They might not trust you. Remember that RSD? They might have received countless amounts of criticism, and they just don't trust educators or the educational system, rightfully so. So just because you think you're a super kind, caring professor, please don't assume that you're going to get their trust. That's got nothing to do with you, so you don't need to take it personally. But I invite you to keep trying to earn that trust. But let's accept that it might not come, or it might be slow to come. I mentioned this before, we do not need pity. We want partners. And last but not least, I've been thinking a lot about this. We're kind of entering, it feels to me, a really turbulent era in human history. And climate change is just that the climate change we've been warned about, it appears to me to be here. And I really think our ADHD learners are the ones who can lead us forward in this, because they're so creative and they're so hardworking and they're so passionate, and they think of things that nobody else thinks of. And I think that's what we need right now to move us forward. So again, assets. Our ADHD learners, I hope, can be our guides and leaders in this increasingly unstable era. Okay. Oh, Judith is popping in. All right, we're going to shift to questions. I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, it's Brady Bunch time. So Q&A has gone. Let's see if I can see it. No. So what questions do you have? You can type them in the chat. You can raise your IRL hand. I can see, I think, everybody. And questions, comments, whatever. Or you can raise your little virtual hand as well, and we'll call on you. We have 30 minutes for questions. 25, close enough. I'm going to look at the chat here. And Shauna, go ahead.
Hey,
if you want to come off mute, that would be lovely.
Yeah, so I'm in a unique position potentially in this call. I both lead a team, but then that team works with learners. So I'm in a situation where I have awareness of learner needs, but I'm also aware of what our team might need. So you had mentioned support for staff. I'm wondering if I can pick your brain for just another minute on that piece. What kinds of tangible support for staff do you think would be helpful for a manager to bring to the table?
So this is, and I'll invite folks in the chat to share on this as well. So information overload and info, I call it, there's a thing on Instagram. I guess you're not supposed to say photo dump anymore or something. And I've been saying the trap of the info dump a lot. So I think one of the most fundamental things for me is managing communications. I get so many emails and I'm just like, really? Did we need that is, if you think of it like a scale, that's a little weight being put onto the scale of my cognitive load, and then the next email and the next email, and that builds up. So it's not just about like, oh, we got to be more mindful about email. You're really impacting people's ability to focus on the important stuff when we're bombarding them with information. So for me, one of the most fundamental things we can do, and this, you don't need to know, if nobody has to have disclosed anything about this, is to really be mindful of that cognitive load and how we present things. So one of the ways I've talked about this with people is like, could you do it in like a weekly newsletter format, where, you group everything, and we're going to always send this out on Fridays. Unless there's an emergency, we're going to send, wrap things up and send them on Fridays. To be mindful about, and I think this relates, how we're using meetings. So meetings can be stimulating and engaging for learners with ADHD, but if it's just like one person talking at you the entire time, it's that I'm going to jump out of my skin energy. So, I would kind of classify both of these under this question of mindful communications. And again, this is good news for everybody, because if you're under stress, if you're experiencing trauma, right, in the COVID era, or for other reasons, this is going to be good for those folks too. Another example would be, I see a lot of folks don't send emails at nights and on the weekends, because, my little phone dings and I'm, at its mercy, right? I try to put my phone away. So setting ground rules for when we're going to send communications, what the expectations are for responding to them, and really, really limiting them within the communications. Real quick, because I see another question, using bullets, using headings can make things easier to consume. When I see like the 9 paragraphs, I read a few sentences and I try to get the gist, and I don't read it all. It's not something that I'm able to do. So mindful communications, if we have folks who've disclosed their disabilities and are able to do so and feel comfortable doing so, keeping a strengths-based mindset and acknowledging challenges as well is really important. And asking those folks, what are your needs and how can I support your needs, if people have disclosed and are open to that conversation. And I see some ideas in the chat for you as well. Great question, Shauna. Thank you.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Cheryl Colin, I saw you next. Go ahead.
So I'm not sure exactly what my question is. I'll just start talking. So I teach I teach some graphic design courses. Primarily, my competencies are about how to use the software, but they're sort of useless without the ability to like critically think about the design, what you're trying to communicate. Did you achieve your communication goals? And so we do regular class critiques, and I try very hard to scaffold that. Like I spend a week just going, this is how we do critique. You can accept or reject, the criticisms, and we're going to focus them on the learner's questions about their work. So the learner is the one that says, did I communicate such and such with this? And then we can answer whether we got that out of it, but we don't go off on a tangent that they're not interested in finding out about their own work. But still, the comments that you made about criticism make me think, am I doing enough there to help those ADHD learners overcome that? Any tiny criticism is devastating. So if there are suggestions regarding that, I would just absolutely love to hear them and incorporate them into this work.
I'm thrilled with that question. Thank you so much. So I guess one thing I want to communicate, and I'm speaking for myself, have I received criticism in my life and navigated through it? Absolutely. So I don't want to make it seem like, that we're just like cowering away from criticism, or that we can't work through it. It's really difficult, right? If I do receive some kind of negative criticism, I'll just hyper focus on it. I'll get stuck in that mindset for like 2 days, and I'm just repeating it over and over, and it's just a bummer. And do I move through it? Yes. Therapy has been great as a tool to help me move through it. But you're not a therapist, and we're not going to give therapy to our students in classes. So the thing that came to mind when you were talking is couple things. Classroom community. So when I took my first education class, I went to Syracuse as an undergrad. It was like EDU 101. The entire course was about how to build classroom community. So for me, like a lot of questions come back to what happened before that, right? And if you have built classroom community, that criticism is going to be balanced out by support and a sense of love and care in the classroom, ideally. I just did an online writing class, and we had to give and get writing critiques. And I was a little nervous about how I was going to handle it. And the professor did an amazing job of building classroom community. So I was able to hear not only the good, but the suggestions for improvement because the previous classroom community had been built. I will say I volunteered to go like basically last, and that gave me time for me to build and connect to that community. If I had gone first, that would have been really tough for me because I wouldn't have felt quite connected yet. So if we know students have disclosed, that might be a conversation like, hey, would you feel better going first and getting it over with? Or would you feel better going later when you might feel more connected? And again, we can partner with our students to have that conversation. And then the other thing that came to mind is structure. So give students appropriate examples in writing so they can, hold on to it about what appropriate feedback looks like, and give them examples about not appropriate feedback. This is just pure criticism and it's mean and you're criticizing the person and not the content. Here's something that's solutions-based, right? That's going to move you forward. I might do an entire class with case studies, scenarios with the students where we walk through examples of giving critiques in a positive way and not so great a way, and have them like, here's a critique. What do you think of it? Did it work? Did it not work? And give them those tangible examples with lots of structure to support the critique process.
Can I comment back and share a structure idea that I do use that you might like this, or other people might want to steal it? I think it's super fun. I take paper that's been used once, so we're printing on the back side of the paper, the unused back side of the paper, but I go get a bunch of paper and I take it to our campus's copy center, and I have them print 4 up a little card, right, that structures feedback. So we start the critique with, here is something that I see in your work. Here is something that I like in your work, if I have something that I like. But if I don't have something I like, then at least here is something that I see. And then we go into some suggestions about the person's question. But as everybody's walking around the room, I hand them a pad. So I have these made into notepads. So they're cutting quarters, they're made into little notepads, and everybody gets their notepad and they can walk around the room and make their notes on everybody's work before we start to talk. So there is some structure that I'm just like handing you on a plate before we start. And it's, I think it's helpful. And then everybody gets to take the little cards that were related to their work and hold on to them as ideas and thoughts. So just throwing that out there to share the idea.
I love that it's tangible, that students can touch and do that. And Brianna's saying, like, model this in your classroom for students. So you might say, critique the critique process, and how can I improve it, as an example of how you can process and receive feedback. I see 3 hands up and I have no idea who was next. Y'all know who was, does somebody want to say, I was next in line? Okay, I'm going to call on somebody. Jeff, you're next. I say, Jeff, beautiful. Hi.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, this has been wonderful. As someone who's not an active teacher, just to hear all of these great strategies. I come to this in the perspective as an ADHD learner, so this has just been really amazing. I had a question. A lot of things resonated, but the thing around role modeling, and I think was just mentioning modeling struggles. And my question to you, Karen, and maybe to the group was like, you mentioned that you believe, and I've read that there's like a belief that there's a large portion of people out there who are undiagnosed. And thinking about like approaching this conversation from an asset-based approach. And I think I heard this first mentioned by that ADHD 2.0 author on like a podcast. He mentioned like one way to get there is to like consider that there's all these high performing people who I think he was like, who are undiagnosed. And so I thought that was really interesting because on the one hand, we're looking at data that says undiagnosed or untreated, I guess, can be harmful. But on the other hand, there's this potential population who have like just thrived and probably also struggled, but more often than not thrived. And I was just curious about also role modeling, like who are these people? What are the creative things that they've done? I feel like I've heard of examples of various CEOs, but yeah, I just want to like throw out that idea and see what people thought.
Great question. If you're on TikTok or you're a lurker like me, Dr. Hollowell, who wrote this book, is on TikTok.
Oh, is he? Yeah, I
Yeah.
am on TikTok. It's a
And
cool,
he does this thing. It was truly probably one of the most important parts of my diagnosis acceptance process. He does his TikToks and he says, people with ADHD, people like me, da 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 da. And when he says people like me, something comes over me, right? This is a medical doctor who's written like 10 books, who has multiple treatment centers around the country. And he says, people with ADHD, people like me. And that has been transformational for me. Like if I ever meet this man, just it's all off. The other thing I want to mention to you is the book, The Gift of Adult I think it's The Gift of Adult ADD. She's using the prior terminology, and I don't have the author's name. It's somewhere in the speaker's notes, but if you Google The Gift of Adult ADD, you'll come up with it. She profiles various ADD folks who are business leaders, who are first responders, who are have invented like 19 things that we all use. When I got diagnosed, I remember Googling like celebrities with ADHD, and it's slim pickings to find people who have, felt comfortable enough and protected enough to share that. I believe Simone Biles, I apologize if I'm wrong, but I believe she has publicly disclosed her challenges. So, I mean, that's an amazing role model for us. But that book has like everyday cool, amazing people. And, something I've been thinking about, folks, and I'm kind of going to pick your brains here, is like, do folks who have ADHD, who do have the privilege and feel protected enough to disclose it, do we reach out to disability accessibility centers and say, hey, can I, I'm happy to talk to your students? Because I don't see that happening by and large. And forgive me if you're doing it and you're not being acknowledged. But I think I tell my students now, so many of my students say I have ADHD. And I say, yeah, me too. It's great to meet you, right? It's not a big deal. It's just, yeah, me too. It's great to meet you. Please keep me updated on how I can help you. I have a feeling that is worth its weight in gold to them, because I know it has been for me. But yeah, check out that book. Thank you.
Thanks,
Great
yeah.
question, Jeff. Marcel, do you have a question for us?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Just a quick one on the instructor side of things. Do you have like a go-to response to colleagues that use rigor as sort of this coded word for like, adhering to neurotypical type of structure?
Jared, I saw you laughing. Jared follows me on Twitter. Yes. So I refer to it, I'm very clear about making sure I distinguish between rigor, which I think is wonderful. I love rigorous learning experiences. Sign me up. I'm ready. I love to learn. What I don't support is what I call toxic rigor, which is, the belief that we all learn one way, or that we should suffer when we learn, or that there's somehow this, the other part of toxic rigor I hear is like, well, Karen, leave your emotions at the door. I love that one. Leave your emotions at the door, like they're shoes that you just take off before you come in. So to be honest, my go-to response is to name it, to name it as toxic rigor. And then I usually say something like, I've never actually seen any research that supports toxic rigor in terms of student learning and success, or faculty learning and success. But I have seen reams and reams of research and data that shows that creating positive, inclusive, supporting learning experiences is great for student learning and faculty learning. And then I usually post like a funny GIF, and then I carry on. So, I think we got to be mindful about how much time and energy we give these people who are committed to what I see as a dying mindset in higher ed of toxic rigor. That's definitely it's not going to serve us in this era that we're entering. So, and then I make friends with lots of really smart people who know fancy things about research, and I retweet them because I call it out the way that I can, and I share the gifts, and I speak from a very heart-centered perspective. And I also know that you want to surround yourself with really smart people and share their research. Sarah Rose Kavanaugh's book, about emotion, the spark of learning, about the importance of positive learning experiences and emotions in the classroom is like, the first that comes to mind that's worth its weight in gold. Another one is John Medina's book, Brain Rules, which talks about how stress and toxic rigor in terms of learning. He's a neuroscientist. So, yeah. And I try to also have compassion because I think it's probably how they were taught. And I think folks who argue for toxic rigor, there's probably some more to that story. Toxic rigor is a way to try to control others. And in my experience, we try to do that when we don't want to deal with our own stuff. So I try to have compassion. It's hard. But I definitely think we got to call it out and say, no, that's not scientific. It's not based on the science of learning. And we got to move the conversation forward into what we want to create. That's
Great, thanks.
My short answer. Jared, go ahead. Hi,
Yeah.
Jared. It's good to see you.
Hey, good to see you. So I'm an instructional designer. So I spend most of my time thinking about designing other people's courses rather than teaching my own. So that's the framework. And so I'm trying to talk through a tension that I'm feeling. So the last couple of years, I've really dug into culturally responsive instruction, which really acknowledges non-Western ways of learning, a lot more open, a lot more flexibility, a lot less linear, which feels like a conflict against the structure piece of supporting neurodiverse learners. I think the answer is both and, but I'm not quite sure. Again, these feels like, I think part of that flexibility could be, well, the flexibility means you can use this structure if it's helpful, or you can do something else if it's helpful. But I'm just trying to balance those two. I'm curious what you thought about that.
I'm so excited. I'm like bouncing on my seat. Because I was thinking about this earlier. So here's the example I want to share with you. And I know folks are kind of like trickling out, no worries. So before I knew I had ADHD, I really didn't have any structure in my days. And it was kind of just like, I would just do what I thought like the next thing I should do is very open and flexible, but I wasn't getting anything done. I was completely stressed out. I was completely overwhelmed, and there was no structure, and I just was spiraling. I now, because I worked with an ADHD coach, which is an amazing experience, and I can recommend her to you if folks DM me. She worked with me to build structure into my days. So I have certain days and times in my week that are very structured because that's what I need to get my work done. But then I have structure, what I guess I would call like high flex, no, structured, flexible spaces in my days when I can be just free and I just do whatever the heck I want. And I don't worry about, I just bop around the house and I'm playing music and no, I want to go on Twitter and no, I want to read this book and no, I want to go for a walk. And I go into that flow state. And that is really, because I created these structured spaces, I created space for me to be my really true wild ADHD self. And then I have the Karen that has goals that she wants to accomplish. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a both and. I think the structures that we create can allow for those flowing, open, beautiful, creative, divergent conversations. I look at ungrading. A lot of folks who've talked to me about ungrading, I don't use ungrading, have said there's very clear structures and guidelines and benchmarks that students and mileposts, I think they call them, where we're checking in. But then there's this very free ability to co-create the classroom with me and the learning experience. So I think it's a both and. And I think that's a great question. I think we got to go further with that. And I love that you brought it up because it's something I'm going to continue to think about. But my initial response is I'm also thinking about restorative yoga. So I used to teach restorative yoga. And in restorative yoga, one of the mantras is support creates release. So when you use props in restorative yoga. So you use bolsters and blankets and blocks and everything. When I'm laying there on my mat and I've got all these supports around me, I can let go. In a vinyasa yoga class, for example, there's no tip. A lot of folks don't use props, right? So it's a very different experience. I can't release in the same way, but the props and the support I get in restorative yoga allows me to And people do let go in sometimes in restorative yoga classes because they feel completely supported. So I think, building in those structures and supports with our students, these are not going to be one size fits all, right? I might say, we got to, here's the timeline we're going to follow. And one of my students might say, can we adapt this? Absolutely. But that initial structure is in place. And then we build out from there, I think. Great question. I see a bunch of other questions. Trail.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
My question is about official diagnosis and sort of your thoughts on that, because there's two things that for me come to mind. So my neurodiversity is more autism, and I'm thinking about like the diagnostic tools for autism are observation. It's not about the internal experience of the person, or it's shifting, but the official like DSM ones are not about the personal experience, but more about like how somebody else observes that person. And I question that, I guess, is what I would say. And then what I'm also thinking of how that links to ADHD is that like the accommodations process. So some of the newer, like the 2008 ADA, American Disabilities Act, and like AHEAD, I forget what that stands for, Higher Education Disability Association, something. They recommend the accommodations process being an interactive process, and putting the experience or the narrative of the student first, valuing that above the diagnosis from a medical point. So it's, shifting from the medical to the more social model in terms of diagnosis. So that was a little bit, two questions in one, but it's just to think about official diagnosis versus or different types of diagnosis and how that fits in.
I gotcha. Is Judith still here? Yes. I couldn't find you. I know we're at time. I can stay, Judith. Can you stay a little bit for the last couple of questions?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So Trail, yes. So we're seeing a shift in the diagnosis process. And I think social media has a big part to do with this. And, another both and, right? I think it's fabulous that people are realizing that they might have these conditions and seeking support on social media. And I also think there can be benefits in seeking out clinicians. I also know that clinicians, a lot of folks I talk to feel worse after those meetings with clinicians and not better. And so there's not one right answer. So, I pursued my diagnosis not only through a therapist who I trusted, but then and I had the resources to do so through a psychologist, and then through a psychiatrist, and, was able, and those worked for me. But some folks are saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go through clinicians. I've read about this. I can see that I have this, and I'm going to seek support through my online community and through reading and self-education. I don't think there's a one size fits all, but we are definitely seeing a shift. And I think in terms of at our institutions, right, you need that formal accommodation. You need those neuropsych results typically to access accommodations. What I think we can do is do more education to faculty to say, you do not need a formal accommodation to accommodate your students, right? So I have a student, they email me and say, I'm trying to get accommodations, but I don't have this and I don't have that. I'm like, let's talk about what you need. Let's get it done. Right. So I don't need, what the heck do I need a letter for to, I'm giving them all extensions and flexible deadlines anyway. Let's meet to talk about how you need to schedule your weeks. Right. And directing them to things like, the things on my computer that block me from going on the websites that are tempting and that use the countdown clock. Mine's called One Focus, directing them to things like that and showing them the planning process. I don't need a formal letter to do that. So the stinky thing about that is it falls on faculty when they're already overwhelmed. So like, that's a problem, but it's tricky. So I'm going to do that in the meantime. But yes, I agree with you. We need to be listening more to what students need and less about whether or not they have a letter. Brianne, you had a question, my friend. And I know folks are dropping out. I'm going to stay till the questions are answered. If you want to hang out, please do so. We got the recording. If you need to take a hike, love you. Thank you for being here. Brianne, go ahead.
Sorry to ask like one at the end here.
No, I love it.
I not surprisingly, I have like 18 things I in theory could ask, but I I kind of wanted to, I guess, ask a little bit more about the consistency across courses, because I've moved into like I spent quite a few years as a faculty member, and now I've moved into educational development, or faculty development, and so when I sometimes when I hear that, like the ADHD in me goes, oh my God, no, like I'm an instructional design side or whatever, because I'm just like, that's like the worst thing ever. And then I also think about students, I should say, sorry, I think it's the worst thing ever, only just because then I really like being creative in teaching. So on that side, so I appreciate your comment earlier about trying to, be mindful of that. Like, it's not necessarily about curbing that, but then I think about the student side, and I would be bored out of my mind if all of my classes looked the same also. And so I just was curious if you could speak, maybe because I suspect maybe I missed it, or it's more about the general kind of layout, for an example, not necessarily restrictive on other aspects. So I just was wondering if you could speak a bit more to that.
Oh, fantastic question. Love it. I'm so glad that you hung with us till the end and asked that. I so appreciate it. So, I'm kind of going to say similar to what I said to Jared. I think it's about a balance between the two. So balancing structure and novelty. I hear what you're saying about novelty. I mentioned the book Brain Rules by John Medina. He's got a great section on how we need to balance structure and novelty, and how we can do that in our teaching and learning spaces. So that's worth checking out. It's not going to be the same for every institution. It's not going to be the same for every division or every department. I think this is a conversation that departments and divisions and institutions need to have. What is it like as an ADHD learner at this campus to navigate through these classes, right? And what is the amount of extraneous load they're experiencing? Yes, the novelty is cool, but what is the amount of extraneous cognitive load they're experiencing when every single one of these classes, like, let's look at how these classes are run and let's look at the syllabi. Is there anything that they can, is there any element that they can count on, a thread that's woven through? So I don't think that's going to be the same for every institution, but I think it's worth having a conversation. And where are some places that we do want to weave in some additional consistency, where we're not going to, I do not want to, oh gosh, no, I do not want a cookie cutter higher education. But I think we can find spaces where we can reduce that extraneous load. The other thing is with the master notebook filing system is the master notebook travels with me as the ADHD learner. So I can say, I can take that into every class, and I know different test taking strategies, note taking. Okay, some professors are going to do this, some professors are going to do that. I can adapt that notebook to different teaching styles, right? That notebook can be that system that we create, that we teach students ideally in a first year experience class, can be a thread of consistency, right? So we're still going to have novelty. Different professors are going to use different strategies, but there's an additional thread of consistency that we can weave in. In our online courses, can we have some level of consistency in organization, and then, use different types of images, use comics, use videos, use Edpuzzle or Flipgrid or some of the ed tech I love. But there's I know where to find the syllabus, right? I mean, when I go into a new online course, I've been teaching people how to teach online for like over a decade. When I go into a new online course, I completely shut down. I panic. I'm overwhelmed. I can't find anything. It's not where I thought it would be. And forget it. I'm not going to do this every single time, because it's so stressful to not know where to go and know what to do. So is there any thread of consistency we can weave in to balance and reduce that extraneous cognitive load? And can we have that conversation about what that's like from the learner experience?
That's super helpful. I just, I also wanted to, just because you reminded me of one more thing. Sorry, it was okay. Sorry. I also was just wondering about, because you're talking about kind of the cognitive load aspect. You kind of addressed it, but I also was thinking a lot about, overwhelm, because I know, like, I shut down if I'm overwhelmed, and I think a lot of learners do. So on one hand, I think that sometimes cognitive load, but I don't always know if it's just a cognitive load thing. I think sometimes it's like it could be like stimulation overload. It could be like emotional overload, just in terms of like just sheer amount of things, like you feel like you have to keep, like balls in the air and stuff. And I don't know, I've never really, I don't know if you've heard or if you've thought of ways in which that can be supported, and or maybe I'm just overthinking and it really does just belong under the cognitive load.
No, absolutely. So there's growing body of research about how ADHD folks perceive and receive stimulation. And it's this tricky thing because we need stimulation and we get wicked overstimulated very easily and overwhelmed, and then we shut down, right? So there's also a lot of overlap between ADHD and autism. If you've ever read the book, I think it's Elaine Aronson, The Highly Sensitive Person. So there's a lot of overlap between autism and ADHD and this concept of highly sensitive people. I'm going to eat lunch after this, and then I'm going into my bedroom and it will be dark, and I'm going to watch, I'm just going to binge TV and just shut it down, because this was extremely stimulating to me and I will crash afterwards. So it's the emotional, it's the social, it's the sensory overload, it's all of those things. So we could talk about, I didn't talk about that, not because it's not real. It's just, there wasn't enough time, but Hollowell talks about that. And then that book, The Highly Sensitive Person, even if you don't end up identifying as highly sensitive, she's got great tips in there about how to manage overwhelm and how to take care of yourself, which is really important. That's a great question. Thank you. All right. I don't see any other hands, so I'm going to wrap us up. Judith, do you have any housekeeping stuff?
No, just a thank you. Thank you so much for the session. It was amazing.
We'll have a recording going out to folks.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
So if you're watching, go ahead.
I'll send a recording and then any resources that were shared in the chat.
Great.
After the session. A session this length will take a couple hours to process. So I would expect to be sending that out tomorrow.
Awesome. Thank you all for sticking it out with us. This is our stay to the end group. Give yourselves a round of applause. I love you all. Thank you so much for being here. Let's keep this conversation going. We've got a lot of work to do and a lot of good things to look forward to for the ADHD community. And keep in touch. It was great to meet you and see you all. Take care.